So in the past I ranked all the Zelda games. So I thought, why not dive into each game and rank the dungeons as well? Today's game just so happens to be one of the highest rated games of all time and one of my favorites, Ocarina of Time. Just for overall structure, the main categories I will be ranking the dungeons on are the lead up to the dungeon, the puzzles or dungeon overview, the main weapon you obtain and its usefulness, the mini and final boss, and overall vibes, whatever that means. With that out of the way, let's jump into my least favorite dungeon. Coming in at number 9, it's Jabu-Jabu's Belly. I don't know if this is really all that shocking, but Jabu-Jabu's Belly gives me the ick from beginning to end. The dungeon takes place after scaling Death Mountain and defeating King Dodongo. Link makes his way to Zora's domain after completing some tasks and getting the silver scale. He then finds a bottle with a message from Princess Ruto, which, she's a real character, but we'll get to her in a second. In the message, she states she needs to be rescued from the inside of a large, smelly fish. Link then talks to Ruto's father, King Zora, and after a lengthy exchange, and King Zora dragging his butt across Hyrule's water supply, Link finally makes his way inside King Jabu-Jabu in order to rescue the princess. I personally feel like this dungeon wasn't too hard. The only thing that really added an extra layer of difficulty was the setting. Since we're inside Jabu-Jabu's belly, everything kind of looks the same. Everything is pink and flesh-like, which can be confusing because a lot of the doors and rooms don't offer any differentiating features until you really walk in far enough. Now remember when I said we'll bring up Princess Ruto later? Well, yeah. Now's the time to bring her up again. Princess Ruto is an extremely whiny character and adds an extra layer of difficulty to this dungeon. Even though you're there to help her escape, she refuses to walk and will get upset if you don't carry her. This can be especially annoying if you accidentally throw her somewhere you weren't supposed to, or you just flat out forgot to bring her with you into another room. If this happens, she then respawns in a specific room, which requires some backtracking, and when you finally reach her, instead of being grateful you came back for her, she gives you a lecture on leaving her behind. Really, Nintendo? The main item we get is none other than the boomerang. The boomerang is really helpful for Child Link both inside and outside of Jabu-Jabu. It functions exactly as you would expect. You throw it to reach, stun, or defeat faraway objects or enemies, and it comes back to you. It's a boomerang. I really don't have anything else to say. The mini-boss for this dungeon is Big Octo. I'm not the biggest fan of this mini-boss, as he can be a little annoying to defeat, especially if you don't know the trick that makes it a bit more bearable. There are two possible ways to do this. One involves chasing him and hitting his exposed weak spot, aka his butt, while the other includes letting him run you over, causing him to go in the opposite direction, and then stunning him with the boomerang. Standing still is definitely the easier option, and I wish I had known that as a kid. The final boss is a bioelectric anemone named Baronade. This final boss has no standout features and is incredibly forgettable. Not to mention this fight involves a lot of waiting your turn, which really isn't unique in a Zelda game, but yeah. Basically you run around avoiding Baronade's electric shots or jellyfish and wait for an opening to slice off its tentacles and attack its main body. That's it. That's the game. Overall, this dungeon probably has the grossest vibes in the entire game. Every time I step foot in King Jabu-Jabu, I imagine the texture and sounds your boots would make while stepping on his pink insides. Number 8. The Water Temple. After completing the Ice Cavern, you make your way to Lake Hylia for the Water Temple. This dungeon is pretty infamous as it's known for being extremely confusing. I remember using a guide as a kid, and somehow I still managed to get lost. For a first-time player, it's pretty intimidating as you have to keep track of the water level and when and how to get to where you need to be when the water level is at a certain point. Not to mention there's a key that almost everyone has forgotten about at least once because it requires some backtracking. In fact, this whole dungeon requires a lot of backtracking, which can get incredibly tedious, along with the constant switching between the iron and Kokiri boots, but that's more of a gameplay issue, so I won't get too into that. However, once you've played through the temple a couple times, it's really not that bad if you have a decent memory. If you play the 3DS version, they take it a step further and color code the water levels onto the wall, basically pointing you in the correct direction so that it's a bit harder to get lost. Wow, I don't think I've ever said this before, but thank you, Nintendo. This temple features an upgrade to my favorite item in all the Zelda games. It's none other than the long shot. It's the hook shot, but better. The long shot allows Link to reach places even farther away. It's incredibly useful both inside and outside of the dungeon. Even though I love both the hookshot and longshot, the timed puzzles in this temple absolutely destroyed me. I suck at aiming, especially under pressure, but that's just a skill issue, so I won't hold it against the water temple. The mini-boss for the water temple is Dark Link. Dark Link is almost exactly like Link and actually features a really cool gimmick. You see, Dark Link copies Link and can actually learn more about how you fight based on your attempted attacks. It gets harder and harder to defeat him the longer the fight drags on. The easiest way to defeat him without him learning too much is to use the Megaton Hammer, Big Goron's Sword, or Din's Fire. I personally opt for the Megaton Hammer as that was the first trick I learned, but all three are perfectly viable ways to defeat him. The final boss is probably the worst boss in the entire game, and honestly, you can probably make a case for it being the worst boss in the entire franchise. Morpha is incredibly underwhelming. You can literally stand in the corner for the entire fight and use your hookshot to pull its core towards you. It's very lackluster and forgettable. However, if Morpha is able to get its hands, or tentacle, on you, then it does deal a ton of damage, which feels kind of embarrassing. Overall, I'm not this temple's biggest fan. I love the way the temple looks and the vibes it has, but it's such a tedious dungeon to complete, especially if you forget that one pesky key. I'm still traumatized all these years later. Number 7. Dodongo's Cavern. I always forget this dungeon exists until I start playing Ocarina of Time. This is the second dungeon of the game, and takes place after you're able to leave Kokiri Forest for the first time. Link makes his way to Kakariko Village and eventually Death Mountain, where he meets the Gorons. After chatting with Darunia and getting a private show, Link makes his way to Dodongo's Cavern in order to gain Darunia's trust. I feel as though this dungeon is pretty straightforward. There's nothing too crazy going on puzzle-wise. There's 3 portions of the dungeon you have to take care of. The left half, the right half, and the center once you drop the jaw of the giant skeleton Dodongo. The hardest part about the whole dungeon is timing the bombs correctly and dealing with fire keys. I hate fire keys. You don't actually get an item for this dungeon, instead you get the Goron's bracelet by talking to Darunia in Goron City before making your way to the temple, so this is kind of awkward. It's a very helpful item as you will need to pick up and use bombs throughout the entire game. There really aren't any mini-bosses, but I guess you could make a case for all the Lizalfos you have to fight. I personally hate Lizalfos, but they're also not too much of a challenge in this game compared to the ones in Skyward Sword. The final boss is of course King Dodongo. This fight is extremely simple and straightforward, yet effective. I mean, it's a fire-breathing dragon reptile Dodongo thingy. How can you not like it? In general, I think it's a pretty inoffensive level. It's not too hard or confusing, it's a slight step up from the first temple and just serves to reinforce and expand upon what you've learned so far. Number 6. The Deku Tree. This is the first dungeon of the game. I think this is one of the best tutorial dungeons in all of Zelda. However, that may be the nostalgia talking. Nevertheless, it's really good at setting the stage for what's to come later on in the game. Within this dungeon, you learn how to think outside of the box and interact with your environment in order to progress. My favorite example of this is when you jump from the top of the Deku Tree onto the cobwebs below, breaking the barrier between the upper and lower parts of the tree. Walking into the Deku Tree for the first time, I certainly did not think that was the way to break through. However, once you're up on that ledge and the wheels start turning, the answer becomes obvious. You also learn that things pretty much work as you would expect in real life. You can mix a wooden stick and fire to create a torch, and use that torch to light other torches and burn cobwebs. By the end of the dungeon, you will be well equipped to deal with enemies and objects in a 3D space, which at the time would be a big jump since all of the previous games were 2D. The main item you receive is the slingshot, and you get it pretty early compared to other dungeons. Again, I think this goes back to the point of getting the player comfortable before encountering real challenges. The slingshot will always be useful inside and outside the Deku Tree, as many puzzles require its use later in the game. The final boss for this level is Queen Goma. Walking into the final boss room, there is nothing to be seen, or so you think. The game forces you to look around the room, and that is when you see her, Queen Goma, hanging from the ceiling. This isn't a particularly hard fight, but by the end of it you will be very accustomed to aiming at a faraway target, as well as identifying an enemy's weak spot. Collect your first heart piece, and exit the dungeon. I really love this dungeon, just for how well it truly sets the tone for the rest of the game. Number 5. Ganon's Castle. I spent so much time here as a kid, as I would frequently open my brother's save file and just mess around with the last portion of the game. After completing all the other dungeons and awakening all of the sages, we are now able to enter Ganon's castle. This is a dungeon I've always really loved. I think having a bunch of trials from each of the different temples is insanely creative, especially for the time this game came out. The puzzles within these rooms force you to use items you obtained in that specific dungeon, but the actual puzzles themselves aren't really difficult or mind-boggling. I feel there was more of an emphasis on how to complete it rather than difficulty. The main item you receive from this temple is the golden gauntlets. This happens almost directly after you receive the silver gauntlets, but with the golden ones, you're able to pick up even heavier things. I feel like talking about the boss for Ganon's castle is a little OP. Of course, it's the end of the game, so there are a lot of cinematic cutscenes that truly build up to the final battles. The first battle is with the king of all that is evil, Ganondorf. This is such a fun and epic fight. You play light ball tennis with Ganondorf and try to evade some of his powerful attacks. The newly acquired light arrows are also required for this fight, stunning him and leaving him open to Link's attacks. After this fight is over, we join Zelda to run to the bottom of the falling castle in order to face Ganondorf again. Only this time he transforms into his demon pig form, named Ganon. The fight with Ganon is extremely easy, while still keeping its cinematic nature. Just roll between Ganon's legs, and attack his tail until you can deliver the final blow. Overall, I think this is the perfect way to finish off the game. I tried not to be super biased, and mainly focus on the temple parts, but it's just so hard knowing what comes directly after it. Number 4. The Shadow Temple. The Shadow Temple takes place after the Water Temple. Link makes his way back to Kakariko Village, only to find the place in shambles. An evil entity has escaped, and now Link must enter the bottom of the well in order to receive an item, aka the Lens of Truth, that will help us with puzzles hidden within the next dungeon. This dungeon is extremely linear. It's really not too hard to figure out where to go and what to do next. If you think you're stuck, just whip out the Lens of Truth, and 9 times out of 10 it will reveal a hidden path. Even though this dungeon is linear, I still think it has some memorable puzzles. For example, using both the hover and iron boots to get across a path with a lot of fans that will blow you to certain death. That sounds kind of wrong. I absolutely adore the hover boots. I vividly remember wanting a pair of them as a child, so I might be a little biased. The hover boots allow you to, well, hover. Inside the temple they are extremely useful, but outside of it you almost never use them again until the very last portion of the game. I personally love the hover boots, however they are a little bit annoying in the same vein as the iron boots. Switching back and forth on the menu screen is a bit tedious. Also, if you leave them on when a puzzle doesn't actively require it, you'll be slipping and sliding around like Bambi on ice. There is no mini-boss for this dungeon, unless you count the abundance of Stalfos fights, or these guys, which are super annoying. I'm not sure what's the best way to defeat them, but I always get grabbed by the hands to lure him out and take the hits in order to defeat him. The final boss, Bongo Bongo, is really memorable for both good and bad reasons. He looks insanely cool. He has these big scary hands and one glowing red eye that disappears when not utilizing the Lens of Truth. The fight is a bit divisive, with some people finding it to be really hard and others finding it to be way too easy. I personally found it to be somewhere in the middle. The vibes this temple has is off the charts. It truly feels like something evil is lurking behind every corner. Number 3. The Fire Temple. The Fire Temple takes place after the Forest Temple. Link makes his way to Death Mountain and Goron City yet again, but this time it's pretty empty. Link meets a Goron named Link, which, that's suspicious.
That's suspicious. That's weird.
Goron Link is the son of Darunia and informs Link about the dragon trying to eat all the Gorons and gives us the Goron tunic. I love how there's a bit of a narrative throughout this dungeon. At the very beginning, Darunia asks for our help in freeing all of the locked up Gorons. Link takes this task very seriously, and I mean, look how happy they all look when you free them. Aww. The actual puzzles in this dungeon definitely try to catch you off guard pretty often. The fire maze, trick doors, and boulders are definitely a source of frustration, but they were still fun to complete. This temple introduces us to the Megaton Hammer. This item doesn't get used as much as other items outside of the temple, but I still think it's a cool addition. The mini-boss for this temple is a flare dancer. It's not a hard fight at all. You just run around and use your hookshot and jump attacks when possible. The main boss is a subterranean lava dragon named Vivalgia. Again, this is also not a hard fight, but it is incredibly epic. I mean, you're fighting a fire-breathing dragon in a volcano. You can either use your newly acquired Megaton hammer or your sword, whichever works best for you. Overall, I feel like nobody really talks about this dungeon. It really is a good temple and offers a new feel with the running narrative. Not to mention, the music is an atmospheric bop. Number 2. The Forest Temple. This is the first temple we take on as adult Link. Before getting to this temple, there are a couple things we need to do, of which 2 of them require you to navigate mazes. One of the mazes being Dompe's amazing cave race, which if you successfully follow him, he will reward you with the hookshot, which is an incredibly useful and iconic item. Most of the temple's puzzles have you going inside and outside of the temple, looking for keys in order to open new doors and progress. The temple itself twists and turns, leading the player to feel uneasy while completing it. This specific hallway that looks curvy but is actually a straight line when you walk through it does it for me every time. The puzzles in this dungeon are quite a mixed bag now that I'm thinking about it. There's block puzzles, puzzles that require thinking outside of the box, and time-based puzzles. However, I will say that most of them lean towards pushing blocks in some capacity. The item we get for the Forest Temple is none other than the Fairy Bow. Of course it is helpful in this dungeon, but also outside of it as well. It will be required in almost every dungeon from here on out. Is there a mini-boss for this temple? I don't know. I would think it's between the countless Stalfos they lock you in a room with, or the Poe sisters. Although the Poe sisters aren't really much of a fight. The final boss is Phantom Ganon. Maybe it's the art nerd in me, but I love the idea of being surrounded by paintings and having to guess which painting he will actually come out of. This is also our first time playing light ball tennis with Ganondorf, so yeah, pretty cool. I love the vibes this temple gives off. It really does feel like an abandoned mansion hidden in the forest somewhere. Number 1. The Spirit Temple. I absolutely love Gerudo Valley. This whole area from beginning to end is so much fun. When you first enter Gerudo Valley, you meet the head carpenter. He tells you that 4 of his men ran off to do God knows what, and he needs your help getting them back. Link makes his way to the Gerudo Fortress, where he is ultimately captured and thrown in jail, as this town only allows women to pass through it. Link escapes and saves all of the carpenters, and due to his display of sneakiness, is given a pass to walk freely and make his way through the desert to the Spirit Temple. In order to complete this dungeon, you have to take it on twice, 7 years apart. Only Child Link is able to get through small holes and collect the silver gauntlets, but only Adult Link is able to wear and use them. This dungeon isn't hard, but I love how both versions of Link play their role in order to complete it. The puzzles aren't that difficult and there's not much room to get lost. It's a very straightforward temple that has a really neat atmosphere. Also, this is kind of random and I've never noticed it before, but the map kind of looks like the female reproductive system, which is kind of funny given that only women live in the desert, but yeah. There are 2 items you get in this temple. Child Link obtains the silver gauntlets that Adult Link uses to obtain the mirror shield. As this is the second to last dungeon, there's not much room to get a lot of use out of them outside of the temple. I absolutely love the mirror shield specifically though. It's another one of those items I wanted as a child. The mirror shield acts like a mirror by reflecting light, but also has the added power of absorption. The mirror shield can absorb certain elements and reflect it back as shown in the final boss fight. Once again, I'm not really sure if there's a mini-boss, but I guess you can count the 3 Iron Knuckles you must defeat as the mini-bosses of the dungeon. They're not hard, especially once you're an adult, and can use something other than the Kokiri sword. The final boss, or bosses, Twin Rova, are absolutely goated. I love them and their humor so much. Twin sisters Kotake and Kome are always bickering. The fight begins with having to reflect their ice or fire beams back at the opposite sister. Once that phase is done, they then transform into one, and you use the mirror shield to absorb and reflect their attacks back at them. I love this fight, and the design for their combined form is absolutely stunning. Overall, I'm obsessed with this section of the game. When I think about Ocarina of Time, this is the part that first comes to mind. 10 out of 10 the best dungeon and area in the game. So what do you think? Do you agree with my list or not? I honestly love all the temples in this game, even though some of them can be quite annoying at times. Let me know if you want me to rank the other dungeons of the other Zelda games and which ones I should do next. My name is Andy and I hope to see you in the next video.